The president often touts his experience as a successful businessman, but one of his ghostwriters is painting a different picture. Charles Leerhsen was behind the 1990 book Surviving at the Top. It describes President Trump's life as a real estate developer in New York City. In an exclusive piece for Yahoo News, Leerhsen details what he saw while chronicling Mr. Trump for the 2 years leading up to the book's publication. He writes, except for an occasional passing look of queasiness or anger when someone came into his Trump Tower office and whispered the daily win-loss numbers at his Atlantic City casinos, he seemed to be bored out of his mind, end quote. Leerhsen's comments come after the New York Times revealed last week the president was more than $1 billion in debt around the same period. Charles Leerhsen joins me now on set. Charles, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
So you write that you saw your time with Mr. Trump between 1988 and 1990 as his King Midas period. And you write, quote, there was a stretch of months when everything he touched turned into a deal. From what you observed, what stood out to you about how he conducted his business affairs?
Well, he had this myth and this aura about him. A lot of people say it started with The Apprentice, but actually it started with that book, The Art of the Deal, and that was his first book that was ghostwritten for him. And that created the myth of this golden boy, this man. And he wasn't a controversial figure. You have to remember, put yourself back at the time. He wasn't political at all. If he was involved in politics, he was a Democrat. And so he had a good track record. He did a couple of good things in the beginning. He rebuilt the skating rink in Central Park and rebuilt the big hotel, the Hyatt Hotel above Grand Central Station. Those were probably the last two successful things he did. Ever since then, it's been a very bumpy ride for him.
So, as we mentioned, the New York Times examined the president's finances for the period 1985 to 94, and that falls in that quote-unquote King Midas period. Remind us of some of the acquisitions that were made by Donald Trump at that time that led into the taking on of this incredible amount of debt.
Sure. Well, he was building up his Atlantic City hotel and casino empire, too, till he finally had 3 hotel casinos there. At the same time, he also bought the Plaza Hotel, a legendary New York landmark. He bought the Eastern Airlines shuttle and renamed it the Trump Shuttle. And he bought a giant 271-foot, I think, yacht. It's more like an ocean liner that he sailed around off the Jersey coast. And all those things he bought, but he really didn't know how to run any of them. That was the problem.
And you describe how Mr. Trump would spend his time. I want to pull out this detail. You write, quote, Trump's portfolio did not jibe with what I saw each day, which to a surprisingly large extent was him looking at fabric swatches. Indeed, flipping through fabric swatches seemed at times to be his main occupation. So if that was the case, from what you observed, was it clear to you who was actually running his businesses?
No, it wasn't. And because just as with the government now, I think he just declines to get involved in a lot of things. They don't interest him. He's not curious about them, and he doesn't know how to do them. So the fabric swatches was a legitimate thing to be concerned about if you're in the hotel business, carpets and drapes and things like that. But usually you would delegate that to a lower person. And it also played into his germophobia because he was always wanting to keep things clean and germ-free. So he was always wanting to replace the carpets and the drapes. So he focused on that because he really didn't know how to run casinos, and he didn't know how to run the Plaza Hotel or certainly an airline shuttle.
We mentioned this in the intro, but what was the reaction when someone would come into the room and you would be there and you would see a bit of a discussion about business? Not very long, it sounds like, protracted discussion, but nevertheless, there were reactions from Donald Trump at that time.
Well, he didn't, as I say in the piece, his big talent was for compartmentalizing things. So he wouldn't think about the bad news too much. So when someone came in, they would whisper a number to him that was the daily win-loss at the casino, and that can vary a lot depending on who's gambling and how the dice go. And if the news was bad, and it usually was, his jaw might drop, he might get a little ashen face or angry, but it was only for seconds, like 30 seconds at most, and then he would move on and think about other things. His failures didn't bother him until they became public, until the public knew about them.
And I want to follow up on that. In your piece, you touch on when the news broke in the early 1990s about his looming bankruptcy. You write, quote, everything had been going to hell for a couple of years by then, but now his failure for the first time was public, and that made it 100 times worse. That made it real. What did you see? How did Mr. Trump react then?
Well, then he was a little subdued and a little worried, I think, and he told me this story about seeing a homeless person on the street, and he realizing that that guy was better off than he was because that man had nothing and he had much less than zero because he was so much in debt. I think he made up that story, but his worries never lasted long, and someone always came to his rescue and propped him up. He always had supporters. Now it's the Republicans. In those days, it was the bankers who supported him in the face of evidence to the contrary. So he's had this history of being supported and carried and propped up for a long time. So that's kind of what saved him and got him through that rough period. Also, if you're an average person and you can't pay your mortgage, the bank will foreclose on your house and take your house back. But if you're someone like Donald Trump, who the banks have loaned hundreds of millions of dollars to, and then your business craters, it's a different reaction. The banks try to work with you to prop you up and to keep you going so they don't lose so much money and people don't get fired at the banks. So it's a very different situation, and that's what he had going for him.
So Tuesday marks the deadline for the Treasury Department to comply with a subpoena for 6 years of the president's taxes. Do you see parallels in what is taking place in the political arena compared to what you observed yourself as the president's ghostwriter back in those couple of years that you spent with him?
Yes, I do. It was very much the same. Just as he came into the Oval Office not really knowing how to run a country, he came into his businesses not knowing how to run them, and it's not my opinion. They all fell apart and went into bankruptcy. So we can just see them fall apart and pass into other hands.
So you talked about this a moment ago as well, but you write that the president is, quote, above average at compartmentalization. And I wonder, some of the earlier signs you just mentioned about the president being able to sort of take bad news at that time as a businessman and kind of quickly file it away. Did you see it in other instances as well?
Yeah, it was a constant, it was a daily thing. He was living in a world that didn't make sense and that he wasn't equipped to handle, and he was in over his head. If this sounds familiar, it's the way things are now, I think, with him and the government. There's a whole government, a whole country that goes on out there, and he focuses on fighting with Joe Biden or what's been on TV lately. He focuses on, that's his equivalent of the fabric swatches now, something he can handle and understand, and he doesn't get beyond that.
I'm curious, back during your time with him, did he ever indicate that he wanted to run for president? Were there signs? Did you observe? Did you hear anything that suggested he was serious about making a run for the presidency?
People would say it because he was such a golden boy at the time. People would say, you ought to run for president, and they would, but no one thought seriously that he or even someone in his position, a real estate developer or a casino operator, could ever be president.
Did he talk about that at all to you? Did you have any conversations or recall anything along those lines?
If it came up, I think he brushed it aside. He wasn't a political person, but also at the time he was, let's not forget, he was a Democrat in name, and probably would have been the kind of person who voted for Hillary Clinton at that time. Yeah.
And for people who say, why bring this up now? Why is it relevant, this period of time that you're talking about?
Well, I wrote this piece for Yahoo News because the news broke in the New York Times about his 10 years of record-breaking financial disasters. And I thought, well, I was there right at the center of that, right at the eye of the storm, and maybe I can contribute to, maybe someone would be interested in what it was like to be with him. And the answer was, it was very quiet in the office, very calm. We just talked about the Yankees, or we talked about little bits of business, and we didn't talk about the main thing, which was that his business was going under.
Well, certainly a perch that not many people have had. Charles Leerhsen. Charles, thanks very much for stopping by. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.